in order for me to properly support you as an ambulatory surgery center and having the instrumentation that you need, making sure that they're in good working order and you have replacements when you need them, is you need to give me some oversight, so to speak, on the instrumentation. That's taken me quite a while to build that trust with my co-leaders on the ASC side of trusting me that my department will take care of this.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of the healthcare industry committed to getting it right. Every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Hank Balch and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Don Williams, manager of sterile instrument processing of the Northwest region at Kaiser Permanente. He is an ISHM Certification Council member and has served as the president of the Northwest Cascade chapter of ISHM. And Hank, I know I say it every week, I'm so excited for the interview, but I really am this time because Don is somebody who has been in the trenches, has done the job, and has tackled a couple of what I would consider to be difficult tasks or projects for Kaiser.
That's right, Justin. And Don is one of those names in the industry that folks recognize, they respect. He is on the Certification Council for ISHM, but he served in a host of other capacities as well. And, frankly, folks like to know what's going on over at Kaiser for sterile processing professionals in particular. We want to see the projects, hear about the success stories, and I think Don is going to share a lot of that with us today.
Yeah, it definitely has a lot of experience and an interesting background. We'll get into that. And a reminder, you can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info. The Facebook page is facebook.com/BeyondCleanPodcast. LinkedIn, you can find us, linkedin.com/company/Beyond Clean. And finally, if you've got a recommendation for a guest on the show, a topic you'd like us to cover, or just general feedback, send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with Don Williams. Joining us now is Don Williams, manager of sterile instrument processing of the Northwest region at Kaiser Permanente. Don, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really our pleasure. And as we always do, we'd like to briefly introduce you, have you talk a little bit about your professional background, maybe start at the beginning of what drew you to sterile processing.
It's actually kind of a funny story. My previous career was law enforcement. When I left law enforcement, I, was trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life again, and not really sure what I wanted to do, because being a police officer is kind of its own niche. You're either overqualified or underqualified for, other items in the real world situation. So based on my background with law enforcement and what I was doing, it seemed to be a natural progression for me to want to go into nursing. I actually had some friends just say, why don't you go be a nurse, man? You enjoy the blood and gore, so to speak. And I thought, well, that sounds all right. And I'm a public service type guy. That's what I want to do. I want to help people. So my wife, was working at our local hospital system, and, she's like, hey, we've got a position open in central service. And I was like, what the heck is that? So she told me what it was, and I, did some research online, and I thought, well, that's a good foot in the door. I'll go to work doing this and then put myself through nursing school and hopefully get a job as a staff nurse or something like that within the hospital. So I applied, I got the job, and I was amazed at what goes on in a sterile processing department. Being a guy, I'm a gadget type of person. I love my gadgets. I love my tools. I remember my first night after shift and going home, and my wife asking me, how was it? I was like a little kid. I get to play with tools and stuff all day long. It's awesome. It was shocking to me, because I think most people really don't understand where things come from as far as instruments or anything like that when they have a surgical procedure. They just, magically show up for the doctors to use. So I was extremely intrigued by it. So, needless to say, the manager at the time, had some health issues, and I was working my shifts, and she was kind of grooming me to take over the department, what I learned. And I'm green. I have no idea what I'm doing. 2 days after I started in the department, I put myself through the course to become certified, just so I could have an idea, a better understanding of what I was doing. And I fell in love with it, absolutely fell in love with it. It was right along the lines of, one aspect of my job in law enforcement of being a deputy coroner / deputy medical examiner. That fell right into my wheelhouse, so I was really intrigued by it all. Needless to say, 8 months into the job, my boss left, and she recommended I take over the department, and I got the job. So here I am, a new face in the department of only 8 months, taking over managing a sterile processing department. Yeah, for me, the type of person that I am, I throw myself into what I'm doing. So I really took it upon myself to learn as much as I possibly could about the industry and what we did, so that way I could be a better resource not only for my staff but for the departments that we serviced. It was quite eye-opening. So from that point, I haven't looked back. I've just continued to grow as an individual, as a tech. My knowledge base, managing departments and having experiences in a couple different facilities has really opened my eyes to how things are done essentially in the Pacific Northwest, of how different hospitals run, and taking the good and the bad and applying it where necessary in each position that I hold.
Yeah, you really did it trial by fire. And both of my neighbors are in law enforcement, and we've always talked about this. My background is as a nurse, Don, and I always felt like it's almost like there's this weird thing, and it really translates between law enforcement and nursing, but there's that invincibility thing where you think, oh, because I'm in public service, and I think teachers have this too, where because I'm doing good things, I can't get hurt, or I can't get sick. I'm a nurse, so I can't get sick. But I don't know if you kind of have seen that in the two cultures too, but I've always thought that they overlapped a little bit.
They definitely do overlap, because I definitely had a lot of cop friends that were married to nurses and vice versa. It seems to be they kind of go hand in hand. As far as that invincibility, sure, it's definitely out there. But for me, growing up and seeing family members be in public service and such, that you're not invincible. My grandfather was a firefighter, and you see what happens out there, and it's like, nobody's invincible. It's having that healthy respect for what you're doing, and not becoming complacent. And that definitely applies to what we're doing on a daily basis. So it just seemed to fit for me.
Don, in your story about getting into the profession, and in particular starting in your department with the manager who already had plans for you, if you will, or at least knew that they were moving on, and after 8 months, you get tapped for the job. And I think it's a story maybe that's becoming more common in the industry. And even today, I was speaking to a young technician out in California and encouraging him that if he gets into a department, applies himself, gains those certifications to differentiate him from every other technician on the street, there is opportunity in a number of places to grow very quickly. How did that experience of the new face in the department coming to run the department, very quickly, how that impact the way that you view career growth, not only for yourself today, but also for the folks who you now lead?
It's definitely a challenge, especially if you start out in that department and you get promoted rather quickly. There seems to be some resentment. Well, I know more than he does. I've been here for 20 years, and he or she doesn't have a clue as to what's going on. But as I started down this path of managing the department, it's not so much of knowing everything. And one thing I did expressly share with staff is that I'm not going to know everything, and I'm not going to pretend to know everything. If I know the answer, I'll give it to you. If I don't know the answer, I will find it and get it to you. And I think, building that healthy respect with staff, that you're not there to bamboozle them. If you're very transparent, the way you carry yourself, the way you treat your team, that comes back tenfold as far as your reputation with not only your staff, but the departments you care for. It's definitely something that it's a great progression. And, obviously there's people that are made for this, so to speak, and those that aren't. But those that do have that drive, that fire to do the right thing and want to make it right, those are our future leaders in this industry. And you just want to nurture them and help them out and get them to that point to where they're successful in their career path and progression to be successful.
I think you bringing up the challenge of resentment and just challenges in general for quick growth. I know there's a lot of folks out there who just think, I want to grow as fast as I can, but they don't necessarily consider, as you said, what's the downside to that, especially if it's the first department that you've worked in, or if you started at the ground floor. And I had a similar experience in the first department that I was promoted to manager in. I started there as a tech that had transferred in from a different hospital. And you're right, even if it's not outright resentment, it is a very lonely feeling. And I tell my leaders this all the time now, that once you come off the floor as a frontline technician and now you're the one in charge of corrective actions and leading staff meetings and holding folks accountable and encouraging as well. But once you're on the other side of that desk, there is a loneliness factor there that you just need to prepare for. And it's not insurmountable, but you just can't get away from it. I want to switch gears, though, real quick. We're talking about leadership in the department, but you've got a ton of experience with leadership, with ISHM in particular, at the chapter level. And I know we've got a lot of folks who listen to this who are sterile processing professionals or also vendors who support these local chapters. And I was wondering if you could speak briefly just about what that experience was like as president of your local chapter, and maybe some pointers on how to do that job and how to lead a chapter well.
Sure. When I first joined the chapter here for the Cascade chapter in Oregon, I just started going to the meetings, and within, again, it was a relatively short time of getting involved, I became the secretary of the chapter, just to have that more involvement and understand how things work and network with other professionals in the region on how they do things. As I progressed through the structure in the chapter, there's a lot of learning there, because not only do you have to, take care of duties within the chapter, setting up educational offerings and talking with vendors and, getting their support, because without the vendor support, our chapters really can't do much. So, and I don't think the vendors get enough thanks and praise with supporting our chapters. They're a vital component to our success as chapters. So definitely having that good rapport and relationship with your vendor partners within your region, and getting them involved as much as possible to, get some fresh education for the chapter. I think the leadership piece, as far as being the president, we need more blood, so to speak, new blood, new faces to join the chapters, to be on the board of directors, to take an officer's position. I don't know if it holds true, where you're at, Hank, but we get into this rut of it's always the same people that are on the board or serving as officers of a chapter, because nobody else really wants to take the time to be involved, or dedicate the extra time to, work on educational events, venues, and such. So I would definitely advocate for folks wanting to get involved with your local chapter. That's the best way to network and be better as a tech, as a manager, as a supervisor, because you realize that you're not the only one having these issues. Somebody from Southern Oregon has the same issue as somebody from the Portland metro area. We all share the same experiences and what are the successes and failures that we have, and somebody has feedback that can actually help somebody else. I'm probably going off on a tangent here, but get involved. That's all I could really say is get involved and work your way up through, the structure of your chapter. Be the future leaders, because, as much as I love doing what I'm doing, I don't want to continue to be a chapter president or what have you for 10, 15 years. We want that new blood in to, keep it fresh.
Yeah, the death of many chapters has been when they don't get new faces, and then the real committed group eventually just hits retirement and leaves. And I would say the other thing that is a real challenge to chapters is all this conglomeration has made it seem for many, I want to say that new blood, they feel like, well, my company is going to give me all that education, and the only reason I would go network would be for career growth and to find my next opportunity where I can climb the ladder at another facility. But I think what you just said is extremely important, Don, just that personal growth, and the real benefit in the networking is sharing different experiences. Like, what if a new vendor brings a new product into your facility? Well, obviously nobody's had experience with that. If you talk about that at one of the chapter meetings, you'll find that product might have been in another facility, and some of the lessons learned can be shared for success at your institution. So it really, it's interesting how devalued, I would say, networking feels like it's become, because people think they can do a lot of this online, but there's just standard conversation, something that maybe podcasting in some way is filling that role in a small group, but it's so much better when everybody's together in a relaxed environment and out of the work scenario.
Most definitely.
All right, we're going to be right back with Don Williams, and we will talk about centralized processing, the implant project, and some challenges and successes as well. We're back with Don Williams, manager of sterile instrument processing of the Northwest region at Kaiser Permanente. And Don, I think we'll just dive right in. I see it's Northwest region, so you're not just taking care of one location. You've got an entire region. Why don't you tell our listeners what that region looks like and what you're responsible for?
Sure. Well, for me, my department specifically takes care of our ambulatory surgery centers and the clinic-based units within our region. And we'd have two separate sterile processing departments for the inpatient hospital. So they each have their own sterile processing department. My department is specifically for all outpatient.
So, Don, talk to us a little bit about what your leadership team looks like there in your department. I'm imagining that with the scope of responsibility comes a fair bit of complexity. So how are y'all managing that today in terms of leaders?
It does. We have, for my department alone, it's myself, and I have two supervisors. I have a day shift and an evening/night supervisor that take care of, the operations for what we do. So it's just us three within the leadership structure for my department.
And are you responsible as well for scope reprocessing in the system?
I am. I've got two locations within the region that do the large diameter scopes. I have two of my surgery centers specifically that do the endo procedures. So I do have staff that do process scopes for them.
And I'm assuming with all those clinics, I've run into this with a lot of the hospitals that I work with on a day in and day out basis, but when they're processing for clinics, the clinics don't necessarily have the same knowledge as maybe the OR does about best practices, using gels or foams, or, how do we make sure that we're doing the point of use cleaning? There's a huge educational task on your part, I'm certain, but even just the basics of making sure that the instruments that come in to be reprocessed and then go back, that communication alone can be difficult, and let alone 150 clinics. That communication alone can be difficult for people that are only managing, maybe 5 to 10 clinics, just because it's remote to where the reprocessing is happening. So maybe start there. How do you set a good foundation for communication between the clinics and your department?
Each clinic has a tracking form that they send in with their instrumentation when they get processed. So as this instrumentation comes through, that tracking form is noted. We verify the contents of what was sent. If there's any discrepancies, we noted it on our tracking forms. And then at that point, we've got these stainless steel coupons that we use, and they'll write down the specific clinic that it is, put it in with the instruments, and it goes through the washer. So that way everything stays together as it comes through, and at that point it's assembled, it's checked, and packaged for sterilization, sterilized, and then it gets outbounded. And most of this happens in I'd say a 12-hour time frame from the time it reaches our department to the time that it goes out for delivery back to the clinic.
That's a pretty excellent turnaround time, to be honest with you. And that must have taken some work. Was it 12-hour turnaround when you first got there, or were there some process improvements you had to put in place?
It's always been like this, as far as I know. As I, kind of dig back into the history of the department and how it started and how things began, the higher volume clinic are generally that next day turnaround. So it comes in at night and it goes out in the morning. And then we have other clinics that are designated as day shift clinics, which when it comes in, it gets processed by my day shift staff. And one thing that's pretty unique about my department is my day shift is only staffed with 3 people.
Wow.
The bulk of my staff is evenings and nights. And even then it's pretty slim. I've got 6 on evenings and 6 on night that are in my main department. So we get a lot of instruments through and a lot of instruments out with 15 people. Pretty remarkable to see how it works. I do have other staff. I actually have staff assigned to my surgery centers, and they do the gross decon there. They'll do the manual wash. I've got enclosed case carts, sealed case carts, and everything that we use. They do everything there. They scan it into decon. They do the assembly and everything, essentially, as they're doing their decon. It gets put into the case carts. It gets transported to the main department. At that point, it gets put through the washer and processed, and sent out.
So your on-location techs are kind of doing the point of use cleaning per se, because a lot of those clinics, it's like right next door to the procedure room, right? You don't have to have 2 levels.
Yeah, well, for my surgery centers, yes. We've got a decontamination room in my 3 surgery centers. The clinics, on the other hand, no. They're just like any other office-based clinic that probably everybody else has as well, where we have the struggles with them doing point of use cleaning, using a hand wash sink to pre-wash their instruments before they get sent to my department. And a lot of that has been one of our process improvements in the last year that I've been in the department is, okay, you guys should be not doing any type of manual cleaning at all. And it's mostly infection control, because they're using a hand wash sink and not a dedicated, soiled utility. So, we've instituted the, point of use cleaning, cleaning off their instruments at point of use, taking it to their soiled utility, and spraying the instruments and putting them in their transpack totes for delivery back to our department for further processing. We want to get them away from handling those instruments as much as possible as far as cleaning is concerned, because they're in there in just their office scrubs, going to town with a pair of gloves and maybe a mask if you're lucky. For everybody's sake, we said, you guys can't be doing this. And they like it because it's like now they can focus more on patient care than having to deal with instruments. So it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, that's a really smart process. I think about all the dental offices that are doing, similar practices to that. And, the regulation's pretty loose. We've had, actually in the area that I live in, we've had a couple of dentists that have spread Hep C just because they don't sterilize the instruments. It's, kind of a public health issue for sure.
Yeah.
It's actually happened in 2 cases in the last 2 or 3 years in my hometown alone. So it's pretty challenging, and I think a lot of it's educational. So let me ask you that one. What I like about your model is you put people out there to control that process as much as possible. But the educational piece, how do you tackle that?
We're fortunate with, as far as our leadership structure, or consultants, coordinators that we have in place that are specifically dedicated to, really being the oversight for our clinics. When I started last year, in Kaiser, I started out as the regional scope coordinator. So it was my job to make sure that, everybody was doing what they're supposed to in processing flexible scopes. That was pretty short-lived. I was in the position 2 months before I got promoted to manager. So, I have a dedicated, now a high-level disinfection coordinator, and that's his job. Is he goes out and he does audits and he talks with the clinics and gives them that education, makes sure that they have competencies in place. If they don't, it's us helping them have what they need to be successful and, not pose a risk, so to speak. So that's a huge piece for us on the high-level disinfection side because a lot of that gets overlooked. You've got clinics that are doing high-level disinfection, if it's urology or ENT, using flexible scopes, cystoscopes or, rhinolaryngoscopes, or even OB clinics that are, using cavity probes or anything like that. They don't know what they don't know. Susie was taught by Sally 10 years ago, and it's that tribal knowledge, on how it was passed down as far as doing their disinfection. So now we've got pretty strict and stringent policy and procedure in place that, is essentially enterprise-wide on how everybody should be doing it, which is great.
Yeah, one of the big success stories coming out of your department is the centralization of these ASCs and in particular the processing of them. I know there's a lot of leaders out there, even perioperative leaders who are listening to this show saying, I've got the same issue. I've got ASCs out there who we need some fixes. And oftentimes one of the best fixes is to centralize that so that you have more oversight, that you have better control over exactly what is getting done, just like you were saying with the policies and procedures. Can you walk us through briefly how you rolled out that project, what made it successful for your team there at Kaiser?
As far as the centralization of processing for the ASCs, that's been in place for years. The thing that for me, as far as the centralization, has been more along the lines of instrumentation, ordering, repairs, and just pure management of instrumentation. As a sterile processing manager, those of us out there that have been managers, we've got a budget that we've got to stick to. You know what you can and what you can't spend with regards to instrumentation. For me currently, it's pretty unique. Essentially, my department is a factory, and instrumentation, I have no budget for instrumentation or anything. So I rely on my surgery centers for instrumentation, and that's essentially for me what I've centralized since I've been in the department, is that in order for me to properly support you as an ambulatory surgery center and having the instrumentation that you need, making sure that they're in good working order and you have replacements when you need them, is you need to give me some oversight, so to speak, on the instrumentation. That's taken me quite a while to build that trust with my co-leaders on the ASC side of trusting me that my department will take care of this. So I instituted ordering forms, recipe changes, if a count sheet needs to be modified, whether something removed or something added, it comes through us rather than the ASC doing it, because in the ASCs, it was all the service leads that would have to take care of their instrumentation. So we had no idea what was coming and going. We had no traceability, no accountability of what was coming through our department. And as we all know, as sterile processing managers, that generally if something goes wrong with an instrument, guess who the first person is that they're going to call? Yeah. It's me. My phone starts ringing. And I'm happy to take the blame. I'm happy to have that accountability, but give it to me. Allow me to be accountable for that. And, over the last year, it's been a huge challenge to get rid of, these sacred cows and such that have been in place for years, to trust that my department is going to take care of you. I actually had one of my techs, jokingly, we had an employee appreciation event over the summertime, and they had a photo booth, for staff to go in and take funny pictures and such. And I had 3 of my staff members take a picture. The picture was hanging up in the core of one of my surgery centers, and I looked in, it had the initials T as in Tom, T as in Tom, P as in Paul, TTP written on it. And I looked at that and I was like, what is that? And what does TTP stand for? He goes, trust the process. And I was like, dude, wow, that is amazing. Wow. That's what we strive for every day, is to have our customers trust the process, trust our process of what we're doing. And so, we're getting there. It's slowly but surely getting to a point where, we're seeing, some substantial workflow improvements, not only within my department and how things are going with instrumentation, also with implant management.
Yeah.
Probably is a good segue going right into implants.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that story about trust the process, that is so huge. And it goes back to a lot of what we talk about on this podcast, the marrying of a culture of growth and accountability in sterile processing that cares, but then also you need processes that work. And it's not just that there's never a failure, it's that when there is a failure, there's a process even for those failures to go back and fix, so that your customers don't lose that trust and faith in what you're doing, and that you're going to be able to deliver. Real quick, I wanted to drill in on that clinic ordering conversation that you talked about, because I know that is any sterile processing department that processes someone else's instruments. That question comes up on, well, who pays for it if it's broken or if it's lost? And I know you said you have a particular budget, set up there where you don't have the budget, but you're asking for accountability. In building that trust with those clinic leaders, how did you go about overcoming that initial fear of, oh, but this is my money and it's my instrument, so I should be the decision maker, to we trust you to clean up those count sheets to make sure that we have the inventory that we need when we need it? What are some concrete ways that you did that early on?
And the one thing with that, and again, I think we're pretty unique in how we operate. So if I am placing an order for something, replacement instruments, or say, a specific service line needs new instruments, to support a new procedure or what have you, it is coming directly from me, and it goes to, our materials person at that specific ASC to institute the order. And it actually goes, when I submit it, so I submit the requisition, and then it goes to that, ASC manager for approval. So they know what's being ordered. It's not like, I've got a blank check, so to speak, and can order whatever I want. They ultimately have to approve what's being asked for. So there's a lot of conversation there with regards to, things that are coming into play, new instruments, replacement instruments, of, why they're needed and what have you. So that way, when they receive that requisition and they're inbox, they know that, okay, this is legit, and they're in the conversation, before it even gets to the point of them receiving it. They know it's coming. So there's that constant communication and collaboration back and forth between not only myself and the service leads who's requesting it, but also with our buyer, our materials coordinators, and, the ASC management. So everybody's in the loop. I'm taking a couple of the steps out of it and streamlining it a bit. So the service leads don't have to worry about ordering. They can continue with their clinical duties and not have to worry about, criminy, I have to, the next time I'm able to get an admin day, try and order all these instruments or these instruments that are missing, that now falls upon my department. So it's that's another win-win for both departments.
It's nice to hear about that specialization for sure. We're speaking with Don Williams, manager of sterile instrument processing of the Northwest region at Kaiser Permanente. We're going to be right back after a short break to talk about implants. Okay, Don, let's jump right back into it and talk about your implant project, and specifically fixing the owned implant inventory. Maybe set the table for the listeners, and then Hank and I will dive into it with you into the details.
Sure. So, when I came on board and took over the department, one of our surgery centers actually had their implants managed by my department. And going out, doing my walkthroughs and everything through the other two ASCs and looking, okay, you guys why isn't your implant inventory being managed by my department? No, we don't know. This is just the way we've always done it. So essentially, I had a great collaboration with my ortho nurse lead over at one of the remaining ASCs that still managed their own inventory. She was on the same page as me and said, why do we have these implants here? These things should be managed by SIP, which is, what my department's called. And, there was some dialogue back and forth. And then finally it was, okay, we got permission to start looking at bringing that inventory to my department to manage. And this really started this project, and didn't think it was going to quite blow up the way it did, in a good way. With regards to going in, I went in one day, there wasn't a lot going on. The ortho lead had brought in every single implant that she could find, because they had implants stored on a shelf out in the hallway. They had implants stored in a cupboard in one space, stored in a cupboard in another space. Implants are that sacred cow. Don't mess with our implants, so to speak. So we started looking at, okay, let's take a look, and I actually did an inventory of their implants. And, they had 20, 30 of a certain screw or a plate, 40 drill bits, just random stuff. They didn't know what they had because it was all over the place. They had them in the, like the fishing tackle box insert, and they didn't manage it very well. So we had made a plan that my department would manage that inventory. So when we started having this discussion, the vendor that we currently use for most of our implants has, an online management system, if you want to call it that, for all their equipment, plates, screws, drill bits, everything. And so, I had asked, can I use this? Not to implement with our inventory software, Lawson or whatever supply chain software that you use. I said, I just want to use this specifically in my department to help me manage these implants, these products. And it took some convincing, but I finally got leadership to say, yes, go ahead, by all means, go ahead and do it. So I physically scanned every single thing that we had into that system. I then printed out the sheet, and the ortho lead and I sat down and we went through line item by line item, of here's what we currently have, how many should we have? And when we started this, we didn't know what we were going to have or how many. It was just, I think it would be okay to have, it seems logical to have 4 instead of 14. So we went through and we did that, and I took all that excess and scanned that as well as a return to the vendor. Right out the gate, I had just over $94,000 of excess implants that we felt were overstocked. So we sent that back to the company, and, because they were owned, we got credit. So they were able to buy a couple new set, for ortho service, which was great. So at that point, I went to our other ASC and said, here's what I'm doing here. I want to do the same thing for your site. And they were a little bit reluctant because they're a smaller ASC and they don't do quite as much. But management was all for it, and they said, go ahead. So I took that inventory in. And the issue that I had with all this inventory is we really didn't have any usage. We had no idea what was being used, what wasn't. Real
that was going to be my
world.
question there, Don, about gathering usage, because I know you said you sat down with the ortho service leads and started looking at these inventory numbers, saying, well, we don't need 40, but let's go with 4.
Right.
How did you use or eventually come to use that kind of usage data to better plan those PAR levels?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually reached out to the vendor and said, asked specifically for each one of my ASCs. I said, please send me the usage, all implant usage for the last 12 months. They sent me, an Excel file of the last year's usage of everything that we had used and the quantities of such that we had used. And having conversations with their software person that manages that platform, I was like, I got to have something that, is more true to what we're actually using instead of guessing of how many we think we should have in our inventory, in our PAR. And, he says, well, actually there is, a formula for determining what your usage is and how often you should order. If you're ordering once a week, you say you used 120 screws over the last 12 months, you divide that by 12, gives you your monthly usage, and then you divide that by 4 to give you your weekly usage. And that's an average, of course. That's not, true blue science, but that is our baseline for what we do for all of our implants now. So when we started that out, it was great.
I was going to tie that in to the first segment where we're talking about what does it take to lead an ISHM chapter well or to grow that kind of networking. And you said something that is applicable again to your success on this implant project, which is collaborate with your vendor partners. If you want your education to be successful, they're out there, they're willing to help, they have resources available. Same thing here. If you got a company who is already selling you the product, and then wouldn't you know, they have some slick technology out there and reports that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you can use it and modify it for the particular projects that you're working on. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think there are a lot of folks out there who are sitting in front of racks of little plastic baggies with barcodes on them, wondering, where do I even start? And as you mentioned at the beginning of this segment, this is a sacred cow filled with landmines. How do I do something that I can justify why I'm doing it to a surgeon or to a perioperative leader? So yeah, that's huge, and I just really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I've gone through this process, we started out once we got the data or the formula, it was like, okay, now I'm gonna wait 6 months, and then I'm going to go back through and reconcile usage again. And so that's what I've done is 6 months goes by, then I go back and I look at usage and I reconcile and say, okay, here's my fast movers, here's my slow movers. We don't use this tray anymore or these implants. We can remove them. And in doing that, after I instituted this implant inventory or management, we went back through and went strictly off of usage, and I shaved off another $60,000 worth of implants that I had done 94,000 the previous 6 months, and then my other ASC, I think it was just under 75. I don't have the numbers right in front of me. And then my largest ASC had, almost $135,000 worth of excess inventory on hand. And over the last, year that I've been dealing with it, I've had, almost $340,000 worth of implants that are going back to the vendor for a credit for my ASCs to, purchase additional trays that they need. When we took over the initial management of implants for the one ASC that we already had in the department, they had done the same thing before. They had returned, just over $90,000 worth of implants. So now, my inventory sits less than $50,000 of owned inventory on hand right now. We order weekly, and, we keep our trays stocked, and, depending on the type of tray it is, some of these trays have enough screws and plates for multiple procedures. But, all in all, I have yet to have an issue with one of my ASCs not having the implants that they need available based on what we're doing with our implant management.
Don, you've been a wonderful guest. I appreciate you also emphasizing usage. Boy, that's such a helper, because that data is how you can convince people. You need to illuminate it, and usage can be so important to that. I'll speak for Hank, and I'll say there was a lot of meat in this interview, a lot of success stories. I love talking to successful managers, but I love even more that we've had a very successful manager share some of those stories on our podcast today. And I want to commend you, because you did go after, I would say, two big, I guess they like to say frogs eat your frog at the beginning of the day, tackle the big stuff. You definitely ate a couple of frogs, big ones that some managers who've been doing the job forever still struggle with today. So I think some of your insights is going to be very useful to the listeners.
I hope so. I think, we've all had our trials and tribulations with our daily interactions with our customers, but, it's taken some time, but, finally starting to make some headway, which is really nice. And it's not all me, I have to give kudos to my staff, because, they're the real, heroes in all of this, as far as I'm concerned. I'm just facilitating it. So, thank you again for that.
Yeah, and I can appreciate you commending the team that is involved in all the aspects of the day-to-day. That's important, and that recognition is meaningful. That was Don Williams, manager of sterile instrument processing of the Northwest region at Kaiser Permanente. And Hank, this one really did have a lot of meat. Like I said, there's just nothing like talking to somebody who's taken on some really difficult challenges that are industry-wide for many managers, and hearing how he did it, the success or the measures that he took to ensure success. And I love trust the process. I live in Pennsylvania, and just as a basketball thing, that was kind of the mantra of the former GM of the Philadelphia 76ers. And it sort of became the sporting NBA joke. But I can tell you, and you and I know this well, trusting the process is exactly what needs to happen for the whole system to work properly.
Not only trusting the process, but one of the themes that came up again and again in this interview was the fact that there are resources out there that are outside the four walls of your facility, and they're not always trying to sell you something. Oftentimes they're there to help and to educate and those resources, also known as vendors, can really rescue you and on some of these large projects when you're looking at a wall of implants, like I said, and you don't know where to start. It's not surprising that folks who are in multiple facilities all across the country would glean best practices and be able to share them. So I hope that our audience who's listening today can walk away and know they're not alone, and there are folks out there that they can network with, not only other leaders, but vendors as well that can help them get to that next step.
Yeah, that whole networking topic was really excellent in the first segment, and we touched upon the fact that the real benefit to networking is just having a dialogue. I think a lot of times people end up having conversations that are very valuable that they don't realize that they're going to have. And he mentioned specifically, we've got to get new people in these ISHM chapters because, quote unquote, I don't want to be chapter president for 20 years. And I have seen chapters fall apart when they're not able to get sort of the younger generation to come in and walk in their footsteps and learn. And I don't blame him either. Being president, let alone the health of the chapter, being president's a lot of work.
It is, Justin, and I'm the president of our South Texas chapter down here in San Antonio, and I've seen it firsthand. There's a lot of stress and responsibility, not only on the shoulders of the president, but the whole board, and finding folks with that willingness and availability outside of work hours for free to commit to something that's bigger than themselves. It's hard to do. Not to say there aren't folks that would like to do it, but oftentimes it's the chicken or the egg. Some folks think, I'm not qualified enough, I'm not plugged in enough, I wouldn't know what to do, so they're not willing to raise their hand and say, well, I'll do it. Or there's others who are willing to do it, but they're always the ones, just like Don said, they're always volunteering and they're always serving on the board, and it's kind of musical chairs among 6 or 7 folks. And the reality, though, is if we as leaders in our departments communicate the importance of these chapters at the department level and the facility level and say, guys, you have got to go to these chapter meetings to learn, to meet, to grow, not only knowledge-wise, but also professionally. If we can push out of the department into these chapters, that will go a long way to seeing them grow.
Amen to that. That's going to do it for this week's show. Just a reminder, though, we are taking next week off, the week of Thanksgiving, so no episode to be released. Enjoy your holiday with your family. And also a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher. We would certainly appreciate a rating and review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.